This is Evolutionary Radio. This is your host, Trevor Kouritzin. As always, Steve Smee is joining me.
Hey, what's up, guys? Good evening.
We've got a really exciting guest joining us today, Dr. James Hoffmann. I'm really excited to get you on the show. We just had Dr. Mike Israetel on. He spoke extremely highly of you.
Ugh, he's the worst.
Dude, he begged me for like 5 months to get him on the podcast, and just so he'd stop emailing me, I had to get him on.
Mike and I have been friends forever, so I hear you. He's great.
So the reason I want to get you on, Dr. Hoffmann, is you have a PhD in sport physiology, and you're an exercise when it comes to recovery. And one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, and I'm guilty of this too, is we go to the gym, we train our freaking butts off, right? Like beast mode, we don't leave anything in the tank. Which is great, don't get me wrong, but then we don't even think about recovery. So that workout, we're not even going to really benefit from, and it doesn't really make logical sense when you think of it, but it's something I see people do time and time and time again.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, right? It's funny when you're dealing with clients and people, it's usually not hard to get them to work out hard, right? Getting somebody to get into the gym and actually get going and do really tough workouts is not the most challenging thing. Getting them to eat well and do other stuff, that can be more of a challenge. But then, like you said, sometimes they just kind of forget about the rest of their life and everything else that's going on, which are all interrelated, right? It's not just like what you do in the gym is the only thing that matters. There's a ton of other lifestyle factors which are going to be influencing the outcomes of what you did in the gym. So if you have people who go hard as, you know what, and then the rest of their life is just chaos and just total disarray all the time, they wonder why they're not making progress. They wonder why they're hitting these crazy plateaus or not getting as lean and sexy as they want. And it's usually because you're not doing a good job on some really basic fundamental things. And that's a problem that a lot of people run into all the time. It's not just about putting the time in the gym. Very often the case is, how do I actually adjust my lifestyle to the rigors of doing all this hard training?
So, Doctor, before we dig into this stuff, before we get to the user questions, because we got an hour to hit all this, introduce yourself a little bit. You said in the pre-talk Temple, so I guess you're from Philadelphia. Tell us a little bit about where are you, what's your background, tell us a little bit about yourself, and tell us exactly what your type of doctor does.
For sure. So I grew up in Chicago, Illinois. That's where I spent most of my life. And I went to the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I studied biochemistry as an undergrad. And I did applied exercise physiology master's there. And then I eventually made my way over to East Tennessee. That's where I met Mike Israetel, and we became friends. And we have the same degree. We both have PhDs in sport physiology. I worked at Temple University as a professor, and then I later became the director of exercise science as a temporary stint over there. And eventually I left that job, and now I'm working for RP full-time, and Mike's doing the same thing, and I moved in with my fiance in Southern California. So I'm actually in Tustin, which is near Los Angeles, and I'm just hanging out here with her, and it's awesome. And somebody like me with a PhD in sport physiology, what we're really good at is taking somebody who's already an excellent athlete and making them a world-class athlete, right? So taking somebody who is already good and taking them to the highest levels, right? And that's generally what sport physiology revolves around. It kind of is different from exercise science and exercise physiology in that it's primarily focused on sport performance, not necessarily finding out more interesting facts about exercise. So that's generally what we do. But it's a big category, right? So you can look at nutrition-related sport physiology, training stuff, recovery stuff, all the above. And so Mike and I were very fortunate to learn a lot about quite a bit of different topics. So, I mean, I don't want to stroke my own ego here too much, but we're lucky that we know a lot about training and nutrition and recovery, and we can put a lot of that stuff together. So most of our day is thought about how do we think about all those things in the most efficacious way for sport.
So one more question though, before I let Trevor jump in. Can you tell us how old you are and how long have you been doing this? Like have you been 15 years, 10 years? How long have you been in this business?
Dr. Hoffmann, just for the record, Steve always asks how old the guest is. And I've told him off air when we have a female guest, I'm like, Steve, you're not supposed to ask that. It's not a
No, I just want to know, just because, someone who can't see him, they just kind of want to get an idea, like how old is this person, just to get a visualization.
I'm 32. I have been I've been involved in sport my whole life. That's one of the primary reasons I've got involved. So I've done American football, wrestling, rugby, martial arts, you name it, I've done it. I got more heavily involved in like strength and conditioning while I was in college, and I was actually a Division I strength coach for a little while. I was worked at an Olympic training site when I was in Tennessee, and then I got into the academic side late in my 20s and early 30s, and now I'm just doing I'm just working for our business and doing mostly online consulting and book writing and stuff like that. So it's hard to kind of put I don't know, a real good number on it. How long have I been in the field? I don't know, because I was doing personal training for a long time. I'd say somewhere around 10 years or so, give or take.
So you definitely have some experience then, in other words.
Yeah, for sure. I've been around the block.
So Dr. Hoffmann, you're a perfect guest for this podcast because generally speaking, our podcast listeners are a very educated audience. Like, these are not someone who's looking to get into the gym for the first time. These are people who have been weight training, 10, 15, even someone like Steve, he's been weight training 20 years. So I wanted to know, what are some specific examples with, good athletes who've been training 10 years, they're already doing the fundamentals, they're training multiple days per week, their nutrition's pretty good. What are some of the things you would do to turn that good athlete into a great athlete?
That's a good question, because there's so many different variables that you can play with. One of the kind of hallmark things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with really good athletes and transcending to new levels of Saiyan, right? Getting them to that Super Saiyan 4 level or whatever you're going for, you have to look at developmental milestones that they have hit in terms of their performance abilities, right? So if you're looking, you can look at sports statistics, things like that, like how many tackles they make per game or how many goals they got this season. And you also look at their fitness standards. You say, okay, how does this particular guy or girl score on the measures that are most relevant to their sport, right? It could be strength, it could be power, it could be some combination of like high intensity, intermittent endurance, who knows? Depends on the sport. But you look at those things and you can say, okay, so what are the top performers doing in that same group, right? So if it's like Division I men's football, can I find information on that? Sure. If it's, world championship level lacrosse, women's lacrosse, can I find information on that? Absolutely. And I can find some of those normative standards and I can say, hey, you should be able to run this fast, jump this high, perform this yo-yo IR test or whatever at this level. Here's where you are. You are competitive in some of these areas, but not competitive in other areas that we have deemed important for your sport. So we would look at not only keeping their strengths strong and even furthering some of the strengths that they already have, but also looking for areas where they are less competitive and those are potentially holding them back from being more competitive. And that can be in the form of fitness, skills, and or tactics. So it's a really fun area. And as a sport physiologist, one of the things we have to do is kind of put numbers to those things, right? We get away from like the Coach Derp who's like, hey man, I tell you what, I've seen them boys doing this football for 20 years right there. That's fine and good, right? But at some point we need to be able to say like, I can show you that you are insufficient and we can train some of these things, or I can show you there is a need for you to get better at this gameplay scenario because typically you score poorly on it, right? So that's kind of the fun of being a sport physiologist, is quantitatively finding and addressing problems in training.
I love that you said that, because my passion is bodybuilding, right? Which is the exact same problem, because it's a very qualitative sport. It's how you look on stage. But I try to apply numbers to it, with things like body weight measurements, things like your scale weight, how much can you lift, things like that. Because
even
then you
your circumference measurements, right? Like how big is your arms? How big are your legs?
Exactly, right? So like, let's say someone's legs. If their legs are an inch bigger and their squat goes up, 99.9999% chance they're building muscle, right?
Yeah.
So at least when we have some quantitative measurements, we can help it apply it to the qualitative goal, which is exactly what you're trying to do too. Like that lacrosse player, they really don't care how fast they can run a 100-meter dash, right? But if that helps them on a breakaway to score a goal, which is the end goal, that makes total sense.
Absolutely. And, we also, there is a role with qualitative measures and subjective measures. That's where like the coach's eye becomes very handy. And so we like to acknowledge, hey, both of those things are important. It's easier for people who are maybe more science and math based to do the quantitative stuff, but there's still plenty of value in somebody who is like a bodybuilding judge and who can say, like, hey, you really need to bring your lats up. I can just tell you from looking at you, And that might be something that, like myself, I might not have an eye for, just not without having the proper experience of judging bodybuilding, right? So somewhere in the middle is probably going to have the best evidence-based practices, where we have people with lots of good experience that we can fall back on, and then other people who can kind of systematically and thoroughly address some of those issues that we see. And so we want to have both. It's not just one or the other. Good coaches have a qualitative and quantitative component.
When in the 80s, since you brought up football earlier, we saw that with Bill Walsh. He was the first one to actually not pound the shit out of his players during training camp and then during the regular season. And back then, like guys like Don Shula would pound the shit out of his players in like 100-degree heat every day. And then if you notice, the Dolphins would always start the season off really hot. They had the best September record. And then they'd get to the playoffs, and then they'd lose year after year after year. But Bill Walsh's teams were the opposite. They started pretty slow, but by the end of the year, they were killing. His playoff record was fantastic. And now all NFL teams, nobody trains in full pads anymore. So we've seen that progression over time. And I always think it's interesting how, like, high school coaches, sometimes they like to pound the shit out of players. When I played high school, they'd pound the shit out of us. They wouldn't let us drink water, because if they did,
stupid. Oh
we were weak for drinking water. So has that really turned around? Like, is the education getting out there, or is it still not yet?
This is a tough one. So football is by far the worst, is one of the worst. I would say wrestling and football are probably, and at least in the United States, some of the two worst, like in terms of knowledge base of sport and exercise sciences permeating into kind of the mainstream. It's really bad, but it is getting a lot better. And we actually see like the NFL, a couple, I think, I can't remember, one of the college teams, they're actually hiring full-time sports scientists now, which is pretty cool. So basically somebody like myself. We see it in other sports like the NBA. They're starting to hire sports scientists. So it is becoming more of a mainstream thing. People are actually acknowledging, hey, there is a science to training. It is worthwhile, and there is payouts. We can actually measure that our athletes are doing better. This is something that in Olympic sports, people figured this out like in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? They figured out like, hey, there are actually all these Russian guys, all these Chinese, all these Eastern Bloc people who have this systematic approach to training, and they are fucking crushed. Can I swear on this? Sorry, I already dropped one. My bad. If it's not.
Swearing's cool. We just try to keep this podcast color neutral.
Gotcha. So they've been just, crushing it in the Olympics and world championship level competitions, right? And unfortunately, like our American sports, we kind of somehow got shielded from that. We kind of stuck with the Coach Derp approach, which I hate. It drives me nuts. And I had a similar experience as you, Steve. When I played football in high school, we would do 3-a-days in August, right? And it would be miserable, total. And luckily, you would have some people who would do well, but they would do well in spite of doing stupid training, right? That does not validate that training that they did. They were successful in spite of doing dumb stuff. So I would like to say that the base level knowledge is definitely going up, but there are some sports where it's just painful to watch. And football and wrestling are two that come to mind. And football, it sucks too, because they have so much money and so much resources. They could hire people to do a better job. I can tell you, having worked in the field and strength and conditioning, you can have somebody with a master's degree in exercise science, CSCS, some in-field experience, and they will not get hired to be an assistant strength coach over some dumbass that is just part of the old boys club that's, some Coach Derp already knew ahead of time. That kind of stuff drives me nuts. You don't see that in a lot of other sports, in like Olympic sports, stuff like that, but you do see it in football, where you have a lot of just uneducated people making very, very critical decisions about our athletes and our young athletes in particular. And sometimes it's a total shit show, and that drives me absolutely nuts. If you go to other places in the world, like the UK and Oceania, like Australia, New Zealand, their base level of sports science is definitely ahead above ours. And that's unfortunate, but when we go and like do seminars over there, a lot of the stuff that we come and talk about, people are already like, oh yeah, duh, we already know this stuff. We've been doing this forever. So it is really interesting to see. And I think the US is coming along slowly, but not at the pace that I would like, unfortunately.
Steve, your mic's on mute. Steve, your mic's still on mute.
Oh, sorry. I can't hear you, buddy.
Can you guys hear me now?
There we go.
Okay, I don't know why it's not working, but this transitions to our first user question that I have. I know Trevor has several, but this kind of goes into kind of maybe overtraining or overexertion. So this guy is asking about something called exertion headaches. And he said he started getting this when he was doing pull-ups, and he basically felt like half his head was going to explode. He said he went to the doctor. The doctor said that his blood pressure was fine. He wanted to give him some, he put him on some Aleve. And he says that since then, every time he does pull-ups specifically, that same thing happens. And he's read online that it can take many months for this to go away. He wants to know, can you ask the doctor if he has any advice, what she should do? Because the doctor he went to doesn't know shit about exercise. So,
yeah. So, things like headaches can arise for a variety of reasons. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint. It's like cramps, right? You can get cramps for any number of reasons. There are some reasons that seem to be more likely than others, but it's hard to narrow down one specific reason. What I would say is it's probably not an overreaching, overtraining thing necessarily if those headaches are only arising during one specific activity, right? If you're getting headaches every single time you train, right now it's becoming more evident that there's like a systemic fatigue effect, right? It's hard to say like just because you're doing one movement and one movement is causing a weird thing like a headache, it's very difficult to say that that is truly a result of like overexertion, overreaching, even overtraining syndrome, because that would start manifesting consistently over time, anytime you did any physical exertion, and it would probably start manifesting in other areas that you would be painfully aware of. Like
he says it happens when he has sex, and it says it happens when he does pull-ups, but he says it doesn't happen when he does other types of exercise in the gym.
That must suck during sex. I feel bad.
Yeah, that sucks. It's affecting your sex life too. That's a big bummer. I am not sure. So what I would say is this, a good way to kind of double check yourself to see if you are truly overreaching, right? Which would be possibly leading to some of these headaches or other things. A couple things that you should look at. The first one being, is your performance tanking, right? Noticeably. So when you go to the gym and you put up a weight or you do an activity that you could do on a Tuesday with your eyes closed and you are nowhere near the weight or reps and sets that you would normally get consistently, that's a big problem, right? Now, everybody has a shit day every now and again. You unrack the bar and it feels like crap and you're like, I don't know if this is going to happen. But then, after a day or two, you get back to normal just because maybe your girlfriend broke up with you, your dog ate your mom, some weird shit happened. Who knows, right? You just had a bad day. But if you see a consistent pattern of performance dropping across virtually all exercise components, that's a bad sign. 2, start looking at perceptive psychological state measures, right? Do you feel an overwhelming amount of anxiety? Do you feel like your world is collapsing around you? Do you feel stressed out, fatigue, anxious, things like that? If you are dinging on any of those kind of measures where you just feel like shit and you don't really know why, not good. 3, another last good way of verifying this is taking a look at some physical measures, right? Like something like a heart rate, whether it's heart rate variability or resting heart rate, something like that. If you notice that your resting heart rate is like 10 or 15 beats above what it normally is, and you can say, all right, I did a performance, I did a psychological, and I have a physical marker, I can pretty clearly say that this guy's overreached, and some of the reasons why he might be having weird instances like headaches and other things might be because he needs to take a deload or maybe even some more serious fatigue management strategies.
So can you be specific on, I'm assuming that everybody should be deloading. So what's a deload strategy? Is it just dropping everything 50%, 50% less sets, 50% less weight? Is it taking time off from the gym and maybe going to some yoga classes instead? What is it specific for guys who are weight trainer gym rats like myself and Trevor and all our listeners?
Yeah. So deloads can be like pre-planned. So you can have like a preset time that you're going to do a deload. Some people like to use auto-regulation. It's more of like a needs basis. But either way, when you do a deload, the biggest thing that you have to do is reduce the training volume. The volume of training is the most related to the amount of fatigue that you're carrying around. Now, the intensity also plays a role, but it is secondary to the volume. So essentially, the more stuff, the more work you do, the more fatigue it generates, and the more that fatigue tends to linger around. So step 1 is reducing the training volume. Now, normally we can throw out a blanket recommendation And like you said, usually saying like, do half the total amount of stuff that you normally would do. So really simple example, right? If you normally would do 6 sets of 10, or even just a more simple example, 4 sets of 10. Instead of doing 4 sets, you do 2 sets of 10 at a similar weight that you would normally do. So the workout should be roughly half of what you normally do. A more specific and more appropriate answer would be to take a microcycle, which is usually for most people like a week, and train at your maintenance volume, which is probably lower than that for most people. I would say closer to about a third of what you would do for your overload training. Now, usually we recommend you break it up into 2 kind of phases. The first half of the week, so maybe Monday through Thursday or Monday through Wednesday, you just do a volume drop, right? So you take the sets and reps that you normally do, cut it in half or closer to maintenance volume, which might be like, 60% less essentially. And so those workouts will be pretty short and pretty sweet, but you're going to maintain roughly the same intensity that you might have done on like week 1 of that particular training cycle, or very close to it. The second half of the week, maybe like Thursday through Sunday, we're going to do another big volume reduction. So take another big chunk off. And we're also going to take probably a very large portion of the intensity, maybe about 60% of what you would normally do for an overloading weight. So those last 1 or 2 sessions throughout the week are going to be very low volume, very low intensity, very likely similar to what you would be doing in your warm-up. At that point, those workouts will be painfully easy. What you should see is, of course, the physical fatigue hopefully has alleviated, but what you also want to look for is a psychological confirmation. And one of the key things you can look for is that the desire to train has come back. And so if you get your athlete and you say, oh, you're doing this deload, and they're like, okay, I got through 3 days of deload, it's fine, it's whatever. They get to day 4 and 5 and they're like, coach, fuck this, I want to train. This is lame. Why are you making me do all these easy days? You did a good job, because now they have reinvigorated their motivation to train, and that is a very good indice that physical and psychological fatigue has been alleviated. So that's usually how we structure them. Obviously, the actual volume that you manipulate is on a person-to-person basis. So what I do for deload is obviously going to be different for what you guys do, but the idea is mostly the same. Take a big chunk of the volume out, have mostly an easy week, and it does a lot of good in the short and long term.
So Dr. Hoffmann, this brings us to a perfect segue to our next listener question. As you know, as an advanced athlete, there's a very fine line between an effective volume and a volume that's going to cause you to overtrain. So what this person wants to know is, how do I know that I've reached an effective volume and maybe my maximal recoverable volume, and I'm not overtraining?
Yeah. So shameless plug. Mike and I wrote a book about that. It's called How Much Should I Train? And we give really explicit recommendations on that. But the quick, easy answer.
You got to finish off your plug. Where can our listeners buy this book?
Oh, thank you. It's on the Renaissance Periodization website in the store. It's called How Much Should I Train? I believe the subtitle is An Introduction to the Volume Landmarks. It's on our website at RP, and I think it's also on the Juggernaut Training Systems website with Chad Wesley Smith. But anyway, so we wrote a book about it, but ultimately, a couple things that you need to track. The biggest teller of whether or not you're in a good zone with your training, whether you're at your minimum effective or maximum recoverable volumes, will be performance again. There are a number of different indices that you can look at, but performance is probably the most telling, most powerful. So if your performance is increasing, or we can even say maintained week to week, you are probably in a good spot, right? The moment that you know you have exceeded your maximum recoverable volume is when performance tanks the next time you train. So let me back up a little bit. Let's say you did 16 sets of chest week 1, and you're like, okay, things are going great. You bump it up a little bit, maybe to 18 sets week 2. Things are still going great. Numbers are still mostly on point. You're having a volume and intensity progression, and your reps are staying pretty constant. Awesome. Great. Week 3, 19 sets. Great. Week 4, you go to 20 sets. But on the first couple sets, you notice instead of getting 10 reps like you expected to, you start getting like 7, 6, 5, 5, something like that. You're like, oh man, that sucks. Maybe I just had a shitty day. The next day you come in to do a different lift and you start seeing that same thing. Like you're supposed to get 10, but you're in like 7, 6, 5, 5, 4. You're really deviating outside of the goal rep range that you set for yourself, whether it was 8 to 12 or 10 to 15, whatever. but you notice that you're really deviating outside of that range. That would be an indicator that what you did the previous week was probably pretty close to your MRV. Maybe not exactly your MRV, but that 19 sets might have been the upper end of what you can tolerate. And then you would start the next mesocycle and maybe lowball it a little bit the next time around. You say, okay, I know 19 put me over the edge. I'm going to try and finish maybe at like 16 or 17 and see how I finished out. Did I actually see a performance drop, or did my performance maintain or even go up throughout the mesocycle? That's a really easy way of figuring out where the maximum is, right? The minimum effective is a little bit more challenging because you have to essentially trial and error downward, right, instead of trial and error upward. So usually when you go up, you have the benefit of at least getting more gains, because most people tend to maybe not train as much as they should. So you trial and error up until you get to the point where you can't do any more, and now you know there's my MRV, right? Unfortunately, to find the minimum effective, you have to trial and error your way down, essentially until you are finding that you are making no significant progress. And so you might find like, okay, 8 sets per week, I'm able to increase my weight each week. I'm able to increase the intensity, and I'm making progress, right? 6 sets per week, no change, right? And you might find, okay, somewhere probably between 6 and 8 is the minimum that I need to do. But I know that like my upper echelon was somewhere around 19. So that in between those two numbers is the zone that I'm generally going to be training in throughout the mesocycle. So it's a little bit of trial and error. It's a little bit of math, but it does pay out huge dividends in the long run. And what we usually say is this trial and error, you can figure out within about 3 mesocycles, you should have a pretty good idea of kind of the mins and maxes that you can tolerate, assuming your program doesn't change drastically, which hopefully it doesn't. And then within about a year, you should have this like locked down pretty tight and pretty solid. So it is a little bit of a little effort up front, but we think it pays out a lot.
So Dr. Hoffmann, I got one more question for you, then I'll let Steve jump in. So what I want to know is, if you find your maximal recoverable volume, does that change from season to season, depending on how much stress you have? And another question I have is steroids. Do steroids affect your maximal recoverable volume? Because this is something we always see on the forums, is someone will be like, hey, I'm doing my first cycle. Now I'm going to start training twice a day, 7 days a week. They think that steroids have all of a sudden turned them into God and they can't overtrain.
Well, sometimes that is true, but not always, but that's a great question. So let's start with the first one. Does MRV change over time? Yes. So what we find is that when you have somebody who is a beginner or novice athlete, they typically have very, very low work capacity, which is essentially their tolerance to voluminous training. And then simply just doing training expands how much they can tolerate. Most of us have experienced that before. When you first start lifting, you do a couple sets and you're wrecked, right? Now, after training 10 or 15 years, you got to do like 20 sets per session to actually get anything out of it, right? It's a pain in the butt. So what we find is that the most that you can tolerate tends to go up very, very rapidly as you gain work capacity over time. And as your training age goes up, we typically see MRV going up, and then kind of plateauing out in sort of an asymptotic way. And typically, once we hit kind of what I would consider like a late intermediate or advanced training age or training status, what we can actually see is it flattens out, and then at some point, it actually takes a steep drop off. And what you can see with really, really advanced athletes is that they are so strong, so powerful, that their training is so disruptive that they simply cannot recover from a lot of those sessions. And you can imagine a guy who's pulling, 700 pounds in a session is simply going to take a lot longer than somebody who's pulling 315, right? That's normal. Most of us already have experienced that to some degree within ourselves. So what we find is that as you get more and more trained, your MRV goes up to a point until you get really, really trained, and then it actually starts to go down because you can disrupt your own homeostasis so much internally. So then we say, okay, that's cool. What is the effect of taking PEDs and steroids, stuff like that? Well, does it enhance your MRV? Yes, it actually raises up the MRV window. Now, I think kind of what you were suggesting is, does it make you infinitely powerful? Do you become, like Thanos and you can just do anything, everything? Maybe. Some people are really high responders to that kind of stuff, and it really is a game changer. I would say for most people, Does it enhance your MRV? Yes, it does raise the MRV, which is why most people can do more training than they previously could. That's the big benefit of taking anabolics. You can train more and benefit from more training, right? On the other hand, it also lowers your minimum effective volume. So the amount of training you actually have to do to get better goes down. So now you have this gigantic window of you don't need to do a whole lot to get better, but you can do a crap load. So you have a very, very large spectrum throughout a mesocycle of how much training you can actually tolerate. So that is a tangible and very good benefit of using PEDs. Of course, PEDs are limited by the sporting competition that you're in. If they say no drugs, then it's no drugs. And in a lot of places, they're illegal. So that's that, and we all know that. But it's a tangible, real benefit. And a lot of times what we find for advanced athletes is that the actual minimum dose of training that they need to do is at or even above their MRV. Wrap your brain around that one. They are so advanced that the amount of training they need to do is actually beyond what they can tolerate. So how do they possibly get better? They can't. There's nowhere for them to go. How do they get better? Well, they start using PEDs, and the MRV window goes up, MEV window goes down, and now they can have optimal training again. That's the big benefit there.
Dr. Hoffmann, have you ever been backstage on a bodybuilding show?
Unfortunately, yes. It's weird. It's a very weird situation.
But what you said about PEDs, it's almost like a buffet. You like go up to someone and be like,
oh, yeah.
I'll trade you some Winstrol for some Anavar.
Yeah, you got any Halo? I got some Tren. I'll trade you, whatever. It's crazy. I did it. I went backstage once, not because I was working. I actually did it on accident. I was trying to actually get to where I was supposed to be watching, and I ended up backstage, and I was like, this is like a shit show. This is crazy. I'm glad I never got into that. It's a crazy world. Kudos to you guys. It's like a level of suffering that's hard to describe.
Yeah, credit to Trevor. I'm not a competitor for bodybuilding though. I did powerlifting. So on that note, let me ask you a question. I'm going to use another NFL analogy. Mm-hmm. And forgive me if I'm inaccurate by saying this, but I do not believe there's a single NFL running back who's over 30 years old. And DeMarco Murray, he just retired, and the guy's like, 30 or 31. Why is that? What happens to our body when we get in our 30s that causes this? I'm almost 40, and I can say for sure when I was in my 20s, I could go lift weights like a madman, and it wouldn't affect me. But now I have to I actually have gotten in my car before to go to the gym. And then I was like, you know what? I really need to take this day off because my body doesn't want me to work out. And I had to just basically just go back inside my house and be like, as much as I want to work out, I know that my body needs a day off. So why is that? Because we hear so many theories, like every guy thinks that, it's because your testosterone levels drop, or it's because your growth hormone drops. And I just think that I think it's more complicated than that. So tell us what happens in our body when we get in our 30s and 40s.
That's another, by the way, are those blue blocks you got on?
Yes.
I was noticing. Very nice.
Yes.
Steve just thinks he's in an episode of Star Wars.
Oh, okay. It's only 5:30 over here, so I haven't put mine.
We're going to get into sleep later, okay. And this has a lot to do with recovery right here. This helps you recover. I noticed. Very nice. So, okay, why do so many running backs not make it past their 30s? Is it purely a physiological thing? No, I think it's a very, very complicated problem. So when you look at American football, now we see people start playing American football at the middle school age, sometimes even less, like at the peewee, child age. And so when you think about football is a sport riddled with injuries. I mean, it's just one of the most gnarly injury sports there is. If you want to look at epidemiology, you can do that. If you want to look at injury rates per contact hour or per exposure, it's not great. And a lot of those injuries are not just bumps and bruises. They're catastrophic injuries or breaks, concussions, neck injuries, things like that. So what's the deal? I would suspect, and granted, I'll fully disclose that I stopped following football once I got into rugby. So I am not up on a lot of the current football stuff. I just lost interest. But what we can say is football has an incredible amount of wear and tear, and those running back positions
are really, really gnarly because they have to do so much sprinting and they take so many contacts from tackles and blocks all the time. And it's not like a lineman where you got these two gigantic guys, but they're starting like a couple feet away from each other, right? So the impact, although they're bigger and stronger generally, may not be as much. With the running backs, you see them always making a block or a tackle from a couple meters back. They always get that big start, right, which increases the impact when they make those contacts. So what we find in most sports, and this is true for most sports with the exception of physique sports and endurance sports, most strength, power, and team-related sports, there's a shelf life. You can only go so long. How long is that? It's not a set-in-stone thing. A number that seems to pop up consistently is around 10 years of being highly competitive, not just like amateur or, like collegiate, but like 10 years being really, really competitive. So what we see with football is we actually see people starting like actual really, really rigorous football training. And you've already mentioned like at the high school age, you have coaches who are beating the living shit out of these kids, doing 3-a-days, doing all this nonsense stuff. Then they go into collegiate and it's even worse. And then you get to the NFL and it's like, holy shit. You've already been actually training football seriously for over 10 years at this point, right? You've already been putting in more work than most people. I think what we see is a major effect of just wear and tear. There's really, it's because when you're in your 30s as a male, it's very difficult to say that you are on the down, right? You're actually peaking. You're at your athletic prime when you're in your early 30s more often than not, except for bodybuilding, which you peak a little bit later on. So you can't really say it's that. It's not like they're getting too old. What I would say is they've really just accumulated too much stress and trauma from training. They've gotten too beat up, too much wear and tear. Their fucking knees are gone. Their neck and head have taken a beating. I suspect it has more to do with that than it does relate to like their physiology deteriorating over time. Does that make sense? I really think it's more.
But what about with like weightlifters? Because like I said, in my 20s, I could go lift weights every day. No problem. Now it's like I have to purposely take days off because I feel like my body will fall apart if I don't. What's going on there? It can't be just because my test levels are lower or my HGH is lower, is it?
Not necessarily. It partially could be related to that. So it's normal to see your MRV decreasing with age past your 30s. So that's normal, right? So usually for males, you peak around your 30s, and then your 40s and 50s, your MRV starts to kind of go down just with genetic aging. That's it. Nothing fancy. One other confounder to that, though, is you're probably a lot more trained and a lot stronger than you were back then, even if you maybe hit some crazy PRs back in the day. Typically, the more trained you are, the more disruptive your training becomes. Just like we said before, like the harder that you can disrupt your own internal systems, the more recovery time it's going to take. So a lot of times people will think back like, man, I used to do like these crazy workouts when I was in high school and college, but you were basically a noob back then. You could just do infinity and it didn't really matter because what you did wasn't that, I don't want to say impressive, but it wasn't that disruptive. Now you've been doing weightlifting, powerlifting for a long time. You can put up some reasonable numbers, right? Like squatting 225 is a lot different than squatting 405. And that's just part of the game. So as you get older, your maximum ability to recover does start to go down a little bit. And you're also probably more muscular and stronger. And so the training that you're doing is inherently harder and takes longer to recover from. That's usually the two big factors.
Not just being stronger, your mind-muscle connection is also so much better, right? If you look at someone when they're first training and they're doing squats, they're doing a squat, but they're not really contracting anything. You know what I mean? They're just kind of like going from A to B.
Yeah, it's just more of a motion. They're not really focusing on working the muscle. Absolutely.
Yeah, someone who's been weight training, 10, 20 years, they've got the constant tension, throughout their quads, their hamstrings, their glutes. Like, even though they might both be lifting 200 pounds, how much muscle time under tension and muscle contraction the experienced lifter is getting is night and day compared to the newbie lifter.
Yeah. And a lot of that's like, so you mentioned mind-muscle connection, and I think that's totally great. And an interplay with that is also like your technique gets better, and your technique becomes more individualized and tailored to suit your specific needs. So it's not only that you are more cognizant of the movement, but you might actually be doing the squat a slight variation in the movement that is better for your quads, right? You might be actually pushing your knees out further rather than doing like, west side sit back and doing mostly like butt and posterior chain kind of action with the squat. So there's like the technical component and that mind muscle component, which can improve over time. I totally agree with that.
So, you know, I don't know if Trevor wants to follow up on that. Do you, Trevor? Or can we move on?
I got another listener question. So you finish this off and then I'll ask that.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask about sleep, but go ahead. You want to ask about sleep first?
I'll ask my listener question, then you can finish it.
Sure, go ahead.
So basically, question for the doctor. You know a lot about recovery. He wants to know what sort of pre-workout and post-workout nutrition, supplements, basically what's your pre- and post-workout protocol for athletes? He's a physique athlete, so he's a bodybuilder. So he's looking more for hypertrophy, maximizing muscle building, minimizing fat loss. But you kind of hear people, they'll say, don't eat carbs before you work out because it might reduce cognitive function. Then you hear people post-workout, that's your anabolic window, so you want to get as much carbs as possible. You hear people saying you should drink carbs during your workout. Some people say you shouldn't. What are your thoughts on all of this, doctor?
Yeah, so this is something that it kind of waxes and wanes. I don't know what the deal, like carbs is this weird thing where like for whatever reason, people are like, no carbs, no carbs. It just kind of like every 10 years, it kind of comes up. And this is something that like,
it's like fashion, man. Like one year it's skinny ties, the next year it's fat ties, the next year it's ties. It's all over the place. It's all over the place. And to me, the research is pretty clear, and it's been kind of pretty consistent and pretty clear since like 1970. So to me, there's an abundance of evidence that suggests a couple things. Taking carbs pre-workout is a good idea for having an intense and voluminous session. So if you give somebody if you give them pre-workout carbs, typically they will perform slightly better, or their maximal ability to perform will be a little bit higher than if they were in a carb depleted state, or maybe not as much carbs. This is something that they've beaten to death for a long time. Do you need to take intra-workout carbs? Maybe. If you're having a session that's an hour and a half or 2 hours or more, it might be worth your time. For anything that's like 90 minutes or less, you may the effect of intra-workout carbohydrate is probably minimal at best. It could be useful, but it might not be like really tangible. Where I think the biggest benefit, especially from a recovery standpoint, of carbohydrate around workout window is in the post-exercise period, because muscle contraction itself stimulates insulin cell receptor sensitivity, stimulates GLUT4 activity within the muscle. There is a temporary window. It's not that's wrong. Let me back up. There is a time frame from immediately following exercise, lasting about 5-ish hours afterwards, where glycogen uptake is slightly enhanced, right? It's not a game changer. It's not like a groundbreaking crazy thing, but there is a time frame there where you can take in more of that carbohydrate into your muscle cell, right? We know that carbohydrate is the primary energy substrate for sporting and exercise related stuff, aside from like walking. So inherently, that's a big part of recovery. You're putting the energy substrate back into the system. Now, in addition to that, carbohydrate has a couple really cool distinct effects. First off, they have anti-catabolic effects. So when you start taking in carbohydrate immediately following exercise, you're already in a heightened catabolic state simply because exercise generated an energy demand, and your body now is breaking things down to meet that energy demand, and that's normal, right? You put carbohydrate in the system, blood glucose levels go up, and what you see immediately is those catabolic hormone activity will start to go down, right? Things like cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of our things that are trying to break things down for energy in the presence of carbohydrates tend to go down immediately. What we also see concurrently is a very strong anabolic effect, where now we can actually see increases in a lot of anabolic activity. Things like insulin will start to go up, which will enhance protein synthesis, glycogen synthesis, stuff like that. So what we typically recommend from a nutrition standpoint is do pre-workout carbs as you see fit, right? Because some people, there might be a time thing where if you have carbs like an hour beforehand, it might make you nauseous and you might paint the wall a new color, which is no good. Some people need it a little further back. Some people can tolerate a lot of carbs right before they work out. I had a Pop-Tart the other day before I squatted, and it was glorious. I felt amazing, and I didn't puke. That was great. Some people can't do that, right? And that's fine. So pre-workout carbs is more of an interpersonal variability thing there. But for the most part, it's a good idea as you can tolerate. The big bolus of carbs that you should get throughout the day typically will come immediately following your workout protocol. And on top of that, what I would generally recommend, and this is unrelated, but well, I guess it's related, but typically what you also want to get your athlete to do immediately following their workout is get into a relaxed state, basically as quickly as they can. And what I mean by that is bringing their
psychological state and their physical state down to baseline. They're already heightened. They're already amped up physically and psychologically from training. Part of that recovery process will be taking in those carbs and getting them back down to essentially resting levels. And that's probably a big 1-2 punch for recovery. If you can sit there and relax for about an hour post-exercise, you're going to be doing yourself a big favor. And this is something you can trial and error. It's really funny. I've done this on myself a bunch of times, and I've told my clients to do it. If you go and do a really gnarly leg workout, and then immediately afterwards, you start milling about, going about your day, doing work stuff, you're on your feet, doing whatever, right? You'll get sore at some point, but you won't really notice until later on. If you go and do that same leg workout and sit and do nothing for an hour, when you try and get back up, you will immediately find that that inflammation and soreness is starting to set in, or setting in a lot faster than normal. And it's one of those indirect signs that, yeah, what you did was overloading, and now you presented that recovery opportunity in the most optimal way, and now you're reaping that reward. So it's something fun that you can play with. And I think a lot of people have experienced, like, if you ever squatted and then done a car trip and you get up and you're like, what the fuck happened to my legs? Well, it's because you were relaxed for a while and you ate some food.
So Dr. Hoffmann, I got one more follow-up question. I'll let Steve pick your brain a bit on sleep. So one thing I constantly see, and this is mostly from, the younger guys just getting into weightlifting, is they think after their workout, they need to have some magic whey protein, glucose, creatine recovery shake. And, and I'm not anti-protein supplements. I think they're very convenient. I think they can be used, especially if you're something like a nurse who, has limited breaks and might need, something that she can drink she needs to drink a meal. But I also tell people, protein supplements aren't anything magic. So what are your thoughts on, like, the post-workout nutrition? Do you think people need to be using, like Vitargo or waxy maize or any of these sort of, like, expensive carb powders, or can they just go home and eat
food? Eat some regular food. Is there a benefit to using, like, really fast digesting stuff like high glycemic carb powders or whey protein isolate or something like that? Sure. But the benefit is probably not applicable to people who only train 5 times a week. And even then, it's very small, maybe not even measurable, right? They're probably going to have just as good of an effect if they, equate the same amount of macronutrients in solid food. They're probably going to have the same effect. So who really benefits from the, like, fast digesting, fancier sports supplements kind of stuff? People who train multiple times per day, like an example might be a collegiate athlete, like a soccer player who has a strength conditioning, a sport practice, and maybe a speed agility session all on the same day. What's going to be the limiting factor to the subsequent exercise performance in each one of those sessions? Well, it's going to be their ability to put glycogen back into their system. So in that case, the carb supplements, and you don't have to buy the fancy ones. Gatorade powder works just as good as anything else, right? You can get some Gatorade powder, a whey protein shake. You don't have to buy the fancy stuff. You can just get the shitty stuff at Walmart, whatever. That might be a more tangible benefit to somebody who's training multiple times per day, where time is a limiting factor to subsequent exercise performance. If you're dealing with, like, CrossFit mom or guy who's bodybuilding 5 or 6 days per week, does it matter a lot? No, it's probably within, like, a 5% difference. So very, very small. Is there still a potential benefit? I would say yes, but keeping in mind the magnitude is so small, it may not be worth fussing over. So whey protein and carbohydrate supplements are good. It's something that we have acknowledged in the past and say, it's probably worth a little bit of effort, but not much effort. What's probably more worth your time is making sure your calories, your macros, and stuff like that are on point. If those are on point, you're on your way. And then that's like the icing on the cake.
So anyone who listens to our podcast, you're not going to be able to see what I'm wearing right now. I'm actually wearing blue blockers, and that is because I wear them once the sun goes down to block blue light. Unfortunately, we do these podcasts late usually, so it goes against my belief to use electronics late, because my melatonin levels don't get a chance to go up. So I put the blue blockers to basically trick my eyes and trick my brain into thinking that it is actually dark, and the blue light from the computer and the lamp and all this stuff as we do this podcast does not affect me. So with that, tell us about sleep. How important is sleep? How would you rank it? And what are some other recovery things that are very important? How much sleep should we be getting, basically? And what are some other recovery tips you can give people besides sleeping correctly?
Yeah, so we wrote a ton about this in our book, Recovering from Training. So for us, sleep was one of the single most important variables that you can control. The most important thing we said was training within your volume landmarks, which we actually already talked about earlier on the show. So we said that's the most important thing. It's going to differentiate undertraining and overtraining. And so we want to be in the middle between those two things. So once we have that covered, sleep is by far the next biggest choke point, by far the most important thing you can do after that. I'm sure you guys have experienced this with your clients and athletes too, right? Where somebody would be like, I want to be the best fucking bodybuilder in the world. And you're like, okay, cool. And they're like, coach, I'm having a real tough time. I'm not recovering as well. You're like, okay, great. Are you, eating all your food? Yep. Are you training well? Yep. You're like, okay, are you sleeping well? Nope. I'm getting like 3 hours of sleep. I'm thinking about taking more tren. You're like, what? It doesn't make any sense. You just throw all that shit out the window at this point. None of that other stuff matters if you're not getting enough sleep. So we all know like sleep's important for your health, but it's also the biggest autonomic regulator for your body, right? So there's absolutely no way that you can maintain a proper anabolic state when you are chronically undersleeping. It's just not going to happen. There's no amount of meth or carbohydrate you can take in the long term to get away from that. In the short term, maybe a little bit, but there's no way around it. So ultimately, sleep is a huge choke point. So we ranked it incredibly highly, only after training within your volume landmarks. So how much sleep should you be getting per night? Well, it turns out there's not a clear-cut answer to that. It is variable from person to person, and it's actually variable within yourself, within the same person, depending on what stuff you have going on. What the literature suggests is this. For most people, somewhere around 6 to 8 hours per night, consistently, every night, usually waking and sleeping, sleeping and arising at the same time seems to be one of the best ways to go about it. For people who are a little bit more advanced and training a little bit more competitively, that might be closer to 8 to 10 hours per night. So 8 seems to be a good reoccurring number for our recreational lifters, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little closer to 6 to 8. For our more advanced lifters and athletes, maybe closer to 8 to 10. Consistency being a very, very big factor there. So there's a couple things we can do to help enhance sleep, which I'm a big fan of. First, so you already pointed out the blue blocker. So when we wrote the recovery book, I got a lot of shit for this lately from people. They say, why didn't you put the blue blocks in there? Well, when I was writing the book, there wasn't enough literature on it at the time. It was promising, but unconvincing. But now several years have passed, and I have found that, yeah, the literature does seem a little bit more compelling on some of the light blocking stuff. So if we would have gone back and updated the book or rewritten the book, which only came out like this year or last year, that might have been included. But it's not included because when we were writing it, which was several years ago, it just didn't seem as compelling at the time.
Yeah, I wrote a sleep article. I didn't mention it either, but I just told people no electronics after 9 o'clock. No TV, no electronics. No TV in your room, no lights in your room. So hopefully, that if you do that, you don't need the blue blockers. But if you, like me, you do work in the evening, you're going to have to use them,
Yeah, and some devices now have the blue block mode too, where you just put it on your device and it's a little bit easier. And I've been, I got a lot of shit from one of our colleagues, and I was like, all right. So I looked back into it and I was like, okay, this does actually seem pretty compelling. And so I've been using them too. I haven't put them on yet because it's still it's only like 5, 6 o'clock out here. But I have been using them more and more, and I have been finding them to be pretty efficacious in terms of not helping me fall asleep, but certainly having less sleep disturbances. I find that when I do wear them consistently, not just like once every other night, right? When I wear them all the time, then I start to see less sleep disturbances, less restless sleep. So that's something I think is on the thumbs up list. A couple other ones that I think are really good is developing a wind down routine. This is something I talk about all the time, but a really good way of helping manage some of the circadian rhythm effects is developing similar patterns of things that happen throughout the day. And one thing I like to do is have this period somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour where I essentially do the same sequence of events that always lead to sleep. So I like to hang out with my fiance and our big fat cat, Piccolo. He looks like a manatee with a tuxedo on. We like to watch, Netflix or anime, hang out on the couch. I'll do my protein shake. I'll do my grooming, my teeth brush, Rogaine in my bald head. And then we'll hit the bed and it's bedtime. Boom, lights out, no problem. I never typically have any trouble falling asleep because I always have that same routine. I don't use my bedroom for anything other than sleep or adult activities. So I try to minimize the amount of time in the bedroom. So a lot of people will work and watch TV and be on their laptop in the bedroom. Avoid doing that if you can. Keep that room as its own separate thing. How you have an office to work in the office and that's all you do in the office? Same idea with the bedroom. Keep that for sleep. It's really, really helpful. Yeah, those are the things that I usually think of the most. The blue block's really good. Some people have actually suggested covering your skin because some light is recepted through the skin as well. I don't know if I buy into that one yet. I think that one's on the maybe list on the docket for a further investigation, but I do like the sunglasses so far. They do look dorky. Mike, Dr. Fiance, and I did a trip to Oceania. We were in Singapore and Australia, and I got them all blue block glasses for the trip. So we were wearing them on the flight. We were looking extra dorky. When the stewardess would come by, she'd be like, oh, okay, great. Bunch of weirdos. But I think they're good.
These are the cheap ones off Amazon, like $8, but they do have nice ones for like $100. But
I got this. I think I have the same pair.
Okay. But the bad news is, I'll say this. The bad news is, guys, for me personally, like you said, everyone's different with sleep. But if I get 7 hours of sleep, I'm just not recovering. Like I need 9. Like, honest to God, I ain't 8.5 to 9, me personally, to get my peak recovery. When I'm doing that, I am recovering like crazy. But if I get only 6 or 7 hours of sleep, doesn't work for me. So you guys who don't sleep enough, it's going to catch up to you. You guys really need to re-examine your lifestyle, and, maybe you need to, cut back on having, 3 or 4 kids or something to change things. I don't know what to tell you, but you're not going to succeed in this getting 6 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep.
It's one of those, I think there's like a parallel. So like, when somebody tells you like, I'm serious and I want to be the best, or I want to be, really good. And you're like, cool. All right. And then it's like they're dehydrated all the time, and they're always dehydrated. And you're like, how serious are you if you don't know that you need to be hydrated, right? At least to some extent. I find sleep to be a parallel thing where you have somebody and they tell you like, I want to be the best. You're like, okay, but they don't sleep. It's like, I can't take you seriously, because you should know by now you should be sleeping. It's the biggest choke point. There's nothing you can do to get around it. You're going to suffer either way. So can't say enough about sleep. If you want to take your training stuff to a higher level, if you want to ascend, right, it has to be a priority. You can't work around it. It has to be a priority. That's really the bottom line.
Dr. Hoffmann, we really appreciate you doing this podcast. For our listeners, how can they learn more about you? How can they buy some of your ebooks? How can they buy some of your programs? Don't be shy. This is a shameless plug. Our listeners actually want to know this information.
Thank you. I appreciate the shameless plug. So you can find me at Renaissance Periodization. It's a mouthful, RP for short. On our website, we have a bunch of ebooks and templates, and we actually have a weekly subscription service where we have tons and tons of content of like video lecture series, a lot of the same lecture series that Mike and I presented at the collegiate level. We have tons of really cool stuff on training, nutrition, recovery, and we actually have a weekly webinar that we do. So every week you can write on our forum and ask Mike and I questions, and we'll answer them on that week's webinar. And we'll call you out by name and say, hey, this person asked this question, here you go. And then we also have a live stream that you can ask. So Renaissance Periodization is where you can find me. I'm also on Instagram, RP Dr. James. I met up with somebody when we did a seminar once, and they were like, bro, I really like the stuff that you guys put out. And I was like, cool. He was like, but I got to tell you, your Instagram fucking sucks. And I was like, oh, sorry. I just put like my cats and like my cat and stupid stuff on there. I don't take it too seriously. But anyways, you can find me on there and on Facebook, James Hoffmann. Those are the main ones.
I don't know how people do it, man. Like, I'm so busy. And like, I see people, they post like every single meal they eat. It's like,
I know.
Going to the gym, exercise 1, exercise 2, exercise 3, exercise. I'm like,
what are you doing? The thing is, like, it's shameless at some point too, because like you should only be posting the lifts of like when it's important, or it's like I don't want to say it doesn't have to be a PR, but it's like, oh yeah, this was like a really good day. Not every set of everything that you did every single day. Come on, what are you doing? I don't want to see that.
I think people have too much time on their hands to post like photos of every single, or like seriously, man. Like some people are like, they'll take a photo of Walmart. It's like at Walmart. Now I'm getting shoes. Now I'm at the post office. Now I'm driving home. Here's a selfie while I'm driving home.
Oh, God. Oh, dude, the worst is like video of me listening to a song that I like while I'm driving. Get out of my face. Unfriend. We're done. Gone. Block.
The ironic thing is, though, that person probably has like 20 people commenting like, oh, bro, I love that song too. And they're like sending them a selfie of them listening to that song.
You should go on America's Got Talent, bro. You're so good. Oh, my God.
Hey, you never know. Maybe
never know.
that's how they're finding their guests now is on Instagram. And
That's right. Hey, but you know what? There's people on Instagram making tens of thousands of dollars doing that shit. So I can hate all I want, but they're probably banking on it, right? So kudos.
Oh, I mean, I get at least 10 to 20. Hey, we love your look. Become a brand ambassador for our supplement or our clothing line, or I get like 10 of those a day. So I'm sure people are like accepting them and doing it.
I know speaking with like Jared and Marissa Inda, some people reach out and ask for some weird stuff too. Do you ever get any of the ones where you're like, okay, no, get out of here, creepo?
I get more people asking my shoe size than a BOGO event at Foot Locker.
Jesus.
The like, you think I'm kidding though, but like honestly, dude.
No, I believe you. Honestly, I've seen it. Mike used to get, like dick pics and all sorts of weird stuff all the time. It's crazy.
I honestly had to take I'm kind of getting into modeling now, but I'm an international model. I actually had to take off all my modeling photos. No, dude, I had to take off all the photos because I was just getting these weird DMs. And the thing is like, it's not from girls; it's from guys.
Guys, we're the creeps. We're always the perpetrators on this. It's always the guys making other people uncomfortable, right? It sucks.
And then like I try to use my Instagram for like this podcast and things like that. And I try to help people. Like I get close to 50 DMs a day from people asking me for advice and stuff. So I just took them down because it's hard to sift through. Okay, here's someone asking my shoe size. Here's someone wanting my dirty underwear. Oh, here's a genuine question for our podcast tonight. Here, you know what I mean? So it's just I just had to take them down because I was just fed up
the
with
dirty
it.
Underwear. What are you gonna do with that underwear? Why do you want this? What do you want with this? Get out of here. I've seen that one before. It's funny, but like it's so weird.
So for all of our listeners, Dr. Hoffmann's Instagram is Dr. What is it?
RP Dr. James.
Send him lots of DMs asking for his dirty underwear.
No.
For your host, Trevor Kouritzin, for my co-host, Steve Smee, and for our special guest, Dr. James Hoffmann. This has been another episode of Evolutionary Radio. Live your life, look good doing it. Thank you for listening.